Hello everyone, this is Michael Rivera. I thought I'd post a short YouTube video on the contentious issue of the impossible turn, that is turning back to the runway when your engine fails on takeoff. And I think I understand a bit of the history of where this comes from. You can look at statistics and you can make the case that everyone who's ever attempted to turn back to the runway has almost always failed, and it's almost always been fatal. And I believe that one of the reasons that is because it's not a skill set that is ever taught to any of us as private pilots. I watched a video, one of the episodes of The Aviators, in which they talked about this particular maneuver, and they had a fellow get into a simulator, and I believe this was at Embry-Riddle University, and they had him attempt to turn back at 500 feet AGL, and he failed miserably, and not surprisingly, because he was actually set up to fail. He was set up to fail because he had no idea of what was required in that maneuver in order to get turned back to the runway. Now, there's a fella who's an aerospace engineer, like I am, who wrote a paper, and he published it in the AIAA Journal, and he also works for the United States Naval Academy, and he wrote a paper called The Possible Impossible Turn, where he set out to determine exactly what were the parameters of this maneuver that would optimize a turn back to the runway. And he concludes in this paper, and you can read it if you like. Again, the title is The Possible Impossible Turn by David F. Rogers, published in 1994 in AIAA Journal of Aircraft. What he concludes this paper, which is quite mathematical, is that the optimum bank angle for this turn is 45 degrees, and the optimal airspeed is as close to stall as you can, that you feel comfortable with. Now, in my particular aircraft, what I did was, I know that my stall speed is about 40 knots, and at a 45 degree bank, you have about a 1.414 load factor on the aircraft, and since your stall speed goes up like the square root of the load factor, that means my stall speed would increase by about 20%, or a factor of 1.2. So I knew that the 40 knots stated in the POH would actually be more like 52 knots at a 45 degree bank. So that understanding, I went up and I practiced this maneuver at altitude at about 65 knots. So I was about 13 knots faster than what the expected stall speed would have been. And so with a comfortable margin of stall speed, I would chop the throttle, and I did these turns. I would do a 360 degree turn, because obviously when you turn back to the runway, it's more of a 270 degree turn and a little bit of an S turn to get back over the runway. So I would do a full 360 degree turn, and I got to where I could consistently do a 360 degree turn and only lose about 300 feet in altitude. So I talked to one of the examiners at the airport I fly from and asked if he would mind accompanying me in practice, an actual practice at 500 foot AGL over the airport. And he said that yes, he would, because he had done it himself and that he could get permission from the airport. So we did that, and I went up with the examiner and I practiced this maneuver. He would chop the throttle at 500 foot AGL, and I would turn back get positioned over the runway with 200 foot to spare. So, and we did this a couple times in the aircraft with him there, and I felt very comfortable that it was quite possible to do this maneuver in this particular aircraft and with the practicing that I had done. So it bothers me. I recently went to one of the FAA wing seminars, and this seminar just happened to be on emergency procedures. And they asked the question of when should you turn back to the runway, and the answer that they gave in the seminar was never. And I took great issue with that, because the answer is not never, the answer is when you have sufficient altitude. It's not a question, never makes it a question of if you should turn back to the runway, not when. So by saying when you should turn back to the runway is when you have sufficient altitude, and that sufficient being defined by your skill set, the aircraft you're flying, what you've practiced and what you're comfortable with doing. So if you've never practiced the turn back to the runway, then you may not want to even attempt it unless you're maybe at 1,000 feet or even higher, maybe 1,000 feet and a mile from the runway, or 2,000 feet and a mile from the runway. So in my mind, this is a skill set that everybody should learn. And it doesn't mean that you have to do it. If you take off in an airport where there are definitely some viable landing spots straight ahead, or then you should use those options and not do what is admittedly a fairly risky maneuver, particularly if you're frightened after the engine's failed. In the particular airplane that I have, there's a bubble canopy, and so I have a great deal of visibility. So during the time that I was making these turns, I could look back and I could see where the runway was. I could see how rapidly I was approaching it. So I felt very comfortable that I could make it to the runway. So I was under no pressure to try to steepen the turn or press on that rudder pedal a little more than I should. The two things I kept in mind when I was doing those maneuvers were airspeed and coordination. Airspeed and coordination, airspeed and coordination. Those are the two things that are going to keep you alive and keep you coordinated and prevent you from entering an incipient spin condition. So again, I believe that the real problem with this whole issue is that people look at the statistics. Well, the statistics are going to be bad because private pilots are never trained in this maneuver. I believe it's an important maneuver to learn. It just becomes another tool on the table for you to use when it's appropriate. Now, I've heard all the arguments, well, you have to take crosswind into account, which, by the way, there was a crosswind, about a 20-knot crosswind when I did these maneuvers, which actually helped me out because I just simply turned into the wind. That kept my turn tighter over the runway. And then, of course, if you're taking off in a heavy headwind, a 15-knot headwind, you probably don't want to turn back to the runway, or you might want to really reconsider it because you'll be landing at pretty high speed, touching down those wheels. You'll probably smoke your wheels pretty good. But if your only option is to ditch in water or land on rooftops, like those are the options for me, turning back to the runway becomes a viable option. In addition, the airport that I take off from has two parallel runways. So I could probably have an engine failure at 400-foot AGL, and I could probably still comfortably turn back around on the parallel runway, provided that there's obviously no one else on that runway. In addition, there is a grass field between the parallel runways, which is also available for my use. So if you understand all of the different caveats that go along with performing this particular maneuver, you understand the performance of your aircraft, what its angle of climb is when you're climbing out versus its angle of descent when you're descending. In my particular aircraft, if I were to attempt to turn back at 600 feet, 600 feet AGL, I would probably be too high, and I'd probably find myself having to enter a slip to get down to the runway. So you can actually end up being too high if your airplane has good climb performance, which mine does. So I would recommend to everyone out there who feels that, quote, this is an impossible turn, to just simply go up, practice the maneuver at altitude, practice it the way I explained it, get this paper and read it if you don't feel comfortable. Make sure that you're at least 1.3 or 1.4 above the stall speed quoted in the POH. That will account for the additional load factor at the high bank, at the 45-degree bank, as well as some comfort factor in there in case you're in gusty winds, or for some reason you happen to your attention is pulled away from your airspeed for a second or two and you lose some airspeed. You want some comfortable margin there. So I would practice this at altitude, so that in case you enter an incipient spin, you can recover. And I would practice it over and over at altitude the way I did, so that I felt very comfortable that I could do it without even looking at the airspeed indicator or the ball. I got to where I could tell just from the feel of the airplane whether I was doing it right or not. This is the other reason why I'm concerned that they show these videos of people attempting to do this in a simulator. Well, in a simulator, at a great disadvantage, because you can't feel what the airplane is doing in a simulator. In a real airplane, you can feel what the airplane is doing, and you can tell if you're coordinated or not without even looking at the ball. And you can tell, if you practice it in the same airplane, you can tell just about what the level of the nose needs to be relative to the horizon to maintain your airspeed. In my plane, I keep the nose probably about 5 degrees below the horizon, and that keeps me going at about 65 knots. But every once in a while, obviously, I'll glance at the airspeed indicator, I'll glance at the ball, make sure I'm centered, make sure I've got the right airspeed. But the point is, I can do it almost blind, and glancing at those instruments are only, maybe glancing at those instruments every 3-4 seconds, just to make sure I'm still on cue, and let physics do its job. For all those out there who think the impossible turns impossible, it is not. It's quite possible. It's a good skill set to learn. And if before you take off, if you keep in mind that, for instance, you have a very long runway relative to your airplane's capabilities, and there's not a very heavy headwind, and you may have a slight crosswind coming from the left or coming from the right, in which case you'll know that you want to turn right or left, and have a decision altitude. My decision altitude happens to be 500 foot AGL at the airport that I take off from, with the airplane I fly and with the skill set that I've developed. So I'm posting this video in the hopes that people out there who really believe that this is a, quote, a good way to kill yourself, really need to understand this maneuver, how to do it, what the caveats are, what the limitations are, how it can be practiced, how they can learn it, how they can get comfortable with it, so that it becomes a viable tool in your toolbox that you can use at the appropriate time. So I invite people to post questions, and I'll do my best to answer them, and we'll talk to you later. So long.